save your pennies because unfortunately the economic outlook is going to get worse before it gets better. Longer term, I do think with a recession, you will get lower prices, which is actually going to crush many companies' earnings and further dovetail into more and more unemployment. So being conservative, careful with your credit cards. Credit card interest rates are egregiously high at over 20%. And obviously, that's going to be an issue as the unemployment rate goes up. You're going to see more and more problems. But just really be careful in your spending. It is a time to hunker down and to try to maintain your savings rather get further into debt, which I know is difficult for many people, but it is going to get harder before it gets better. Inflation is probably the biggest hurdle. It's not just here in the United States. There's a cost of living crisis in Europe, also. So first would be inflation, and second, I would have to pull forward, to have government debt. Federal government debt as a share of GDP at basically 100%. It's not currently viewed as a short-term crisis, but I think longer term it is. We are going to have to do some major fiscal reform. It's not tax receipts that are the problem. Tax receipts are actually very, very high relative to economic activity. The problem is government spending. Government, and it's not just defense spending. It's not just interest expense. It's the whole bucket, particularly entitlements. And unfortunately, at some point, we've entitled way too many people by putting in place way too aggressive entitlement programs in this country around COVID. And it's keeping people out of the workforce. And so we really need to have major budget reform. But unfortunately, I'm going to be more specific. We really need to have major government spending reform. I don't think we need to raise taxes. I would not be an advocate for raising taxes. It has to really be on the spending side. But there's no sign that that's going to happen. I think only Wall Street and Washington look at the rate of change in inflation. And it has slowed if you look at the rate of change. But the price levels are still egregiously high. Let me give you an example. Soup prices are 30% higher than they were pre-COVID. You have similar trends in a lot of food products. It's not just restaurants that have raised prices significantly. It's also in the grocery store, which is creating, I would agree, a cost of living crisis for many individuals in the country today. And so I think price levels are underappreciated as still egregiously high. And that in order to really get those down, unfortunately, it classically does take an outright decline in economic activity or a recession. So I think consumers have every right to be protesting these higher prices. You are increasingly seeing consumers trade down, buy less within grocery stores. As a result of that. And it's actually quite a difficult dilemma. On one hand, if you have a recession, that means the unemployment rate goes up. And indeed, that's going to put even more pressure on everybody. It's not just going to be low-income workers that are going to get laid off. It will be across the board. But we are better to take that short-term hit to crunch these price levels back down to normal so when we can come out of the recession, you can actually have a healthier, sustained economic cycle. An economic recovery would unfold over time. I can be very bullish on the recovery as we come out in late 2024, early 2025. What we've called is the manufacturing renaissance that started in 2010. The Biden administration did not start the manufacturing renaissance. The private sector did in 2010. I've written about this for the past 13 years. Companies recognizing the need for onshoring. There's nothing more positive for an economy when it's driven by the private sector, which I'm going to emphasize, when you bring capital spending back to this country, because of the huge job multiplier it does indeed create. And I do worry this booster shot we've seen from Washington actually is going to potentially create excesses. Are we going to build too many semiconductor plants? Let the private sector do this themselves. So I can get pretty bullish on the economy coming out of the recession, assuming we allow the unemployment rate to go up, assuming we really can crush inflation because of the manufacturing renaissance that's been going on now for more than a decade, creating a healthy labor market. But simultaneously, we have to deal with a budget deficit. And we have to curtail government spending, and we have to do entitlement reform, including Social Security reform, in which you're not talking about cutting Social Security checks. What you're doing is talking about elongating the time in which people can actually receive their Social Security. We did this historically. We did this with Greenspan and Reagan back in the early 1980s. It was very successful. It was not painful for the Social Security recipients, and it actually creates a healthier economic backdrop and is better for the entire population if you deal with entitlement reform, including slowing down Social Security eligibility. We have to get back to kind of a normal work ethic, which I can see in the horizon, but we need change. We need less government entitlement spending. We need a lower budget deficit. We need a sustained period of low inflation. And I can see that on the horizon, but it's going to take a lot of tough decisions in Washington for that to happen. And as of now, they're not doing it.